Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Someone who I've interviewed before, Amanda Christman Larson, is now in Lviv, Ukraine. And she's got this fascinating story about being a digital nomad, traveling the world, working as she travels to interesting places. And that's a fascinating story. But why, Amanda, are you in Lviv, Ukraine, in the middle of a war?
Well, I will tell you, a lot of people in my life want to know that. I'm actually doing some work here for Hope for Ukraine. I'm on the board for Hope for Ukraine, and I am. This is my project. My project is to document the lives of people who have been displaced by war, as well as document some of the war crimes that have been occurring.
What is Hope for Ukraine?
Hope for Ukraine is one of the largest aid organizations that's working within Ukraine. The organization itself was started by Ukrainians, and it's run out of the United States, where some of them are living now. And it's just a fantastic organization that provides food aid and lots of things like toiletries and basic needs, diapers, things for women, all kinds of stuff to a lot of the homes that are in occupied areas or formerly occupied areas that have no access to the basic things. And then also they have a refugee center for people who have been displaced, and they've been able to house over 3,000 people. So it's been pretty incredible.
How did you get involved in the organization?
Well, I actually met the president of the board on a train, and we got to talking and kept in touch. And a few months later, I asked him how I could help with what he's doing, and ended up on the board myself. And here we are.
Excellent. Where was the train?
It was in Germany.
So you met the president on the train in Germany on one of your other travels, and he recruited you to the board of Hope for Ukraine. And so you're there. Let's get into a little bit more about the organization in a bit. But I've seen some pictures that you posted about life in Lviv. Doesn't look like there's any war going on.
I was so surprised. I, in my head, had all kinds of visions of what it would be like, and I was wrong on every count. Here in Lviv, I wouldn't say it's completely safe, because we did have a missile strike here this last week, but it's been struck a whole lot less than other places. And as far as life goes, I can't believe it. People are out on the streets, in the evenings, there's music everywhere. It's just been incredible, because like what did this just do, Brian?
Yeah, no, I'm just showing a picture.
Okay, I was really confused. I'm sorry. But yeah, there's music everywhere. There's like children playing, and they have a splash pool kind of thing right in the center of downtown in the park. There's so much happening here. Last night I went to the opera. There's restaurants everywhere that are fantastic. There's places to get your nails done. There's life is just happening as normal here. But I think that it's almost happening with more love for life than what probably happened before the war. I think every day people are appreciating the life that they have and the things that are available.
I was surprised that your pictures showed so much life on the streets. Wouldn't people be scared of being on the street and want to go inside?
No, because if they lived their lives that way, they wouldn't live. And so I think they're just determined to live, whatever that looks like. This was a kind of a funny video. This is in the park. They've got this like little target shooting thing. It's a game, and it's got Putin on there. So that's not a real loving picture. But yeah, people were just what you're showing right now. There were just a group of older people singing in the park, and that happens all the time. There are bands. There's performances. There are people playing accordion, or people playing instruments I've never seen before. Sometimes there's men playing backgammon and chess, and it's just so much life here. I was not expecting that, and I think it's kind of a beautiful testament to humanity that it's happening.
So is it just sort of Stockholm syndrome or something that you just get moving and put up with the war and forget that it's happening?
I don't think they're definitely not forgetting that it's happening, because it's happening to people all around them. And, everyone is worried that their loved ones are either on the front line or are going to be recruited to go, because they're sending soldiers in waves, and they are doing a draft type system. But I think they're just loving life while they can. It's kind of like when we all came out of COVID and we'd all been, anytime we could get out and do something, we would get out and do it. And this is very much like that too. We've got the threat of missile attacks all the time. The air raid sirens go off. I think yesterday was the first day I didn't hear a single air raid siren, but they go off all the time. And anytime a MiG is deployed anywhere in the entire country gets air raid air raid siren goes off. And I just think everybody's doing everything they can to live life while they can, because they don't know how long it'll last.
Now, Lviv is in Western Ukraine, quite a ways away from the front line. Is that correct?
It is. It's quite far west. It's about an hour and a half drive from Poland.
And how far from Kyiv?
It's 300 miles from Kiev.
Okay, so it's still a fair amount of distance. But you're saying it has come under attack.
We had a missile attack here. I believe it was Tuesday. So just less than a week ago. Yeah.
Now, do you notice that there's less men around if they've been drafted?
Yeah, I think so. I actually was talking to my friend about that. Yeah, that is obvious. And the other thing that's obvious is, the estimate, and I think the estimate is low, over 50,000 people, soldiers, mostly men, here in Ukraine have lost limbs fighting in the war. And because one of the largest military hospitals is located in this city, we see that a lot. Just on the streets, there are quite a few men who just, they have prosthetics, and it takes you, makes you pause to see that stuff and realize the sacrifice, and see people walking down the street as if everything's normal with an artificial limb. It's very, I can't even begin to describe the depth of humanity that's in things here. It's just incredible.
Now, you travel the world, and you've been to numerous different places. Is Lviv more challenging or the same as some of your travels elsewhere?
It's more challenging. I haven't been anywhere else where I have felt any kind of sense of danger, really. And here, with the job that I'm doing, we're interviewing people who are, in some cases, incredibly traumatized, and the things that have happened to them are awful, unbelievable, cannot even imagine the depths of the awful. But hearing those stories throughout the day, over the last few days, there have been a couple of times when I found myself just really overwhelmed. And in fact, yesterday, I just spent the entire morning until I went out in the evening with my friends here, that I don't want to talk to anybody. I just really needed to just have some time. And I had bad dreams before about, needing to escape, because what if something happened in this city that's happened in the other cities that have been occupied? It's the things that have happened so suddenly and so traumatically that I realized that, we kind of always think we're going to be okay. And, but all these people thought they were going to be okay. And I see that, and I realize how fragile everything really is here. This is a very fragile piece here in Lviv.
I can't imagine being in the middle of a war zone, or in a country that's in a war. Amanda Christman Larson, thanks for sharing this story with us. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in 2 minutes. And we're going to ask Amanda to tell us about some of the interviews and the people that she's met. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're joined tonight by Amanda Christman Larson, who has joined us from Lviv, Ukraine, where she is for the better part of this month, interviewing people for Hope for Ukraine, an organization that she's on the board of. Amanda's got an interesting story that she's a digital nomad. She's been traveling the world. So travel is not a shock to her, but this is the first time you've been in a war zone, and you're there interviewing people. Amanda, tell us, if you could, some of the stories that you've heard.
Well, I guess I'd start by saying nothing can prepare you to hear some of these stories. I mean, we see the news stuff on the news. We see the burned out buildings, we see soldiers, we see, visions like that. What we don't see is the teachers and the secretaries and the IT people and the young families and the old people and women and children who are innocent victims in all of this. And, lots of men are innocent victims too, of course. But it's people like you and me that we're not seeing on the news, and we're not really getting their stories. I think early in the war, there was a video that came out on some news station. It was a woman trying to run with her children, and she was shot down and killed. That kind of stuff is happening all the time. And we're not hearing about that stuff. And that's what we're here to do, is to bring those stories, bring humanity to it, because it is shocking. It is horrendous, and it's something that really has to be stopped. So as far as the interviews go, there have been, so far we've done 5. I think originally they thought, here at Hope for Ukraine, they thought they would last maybe half an hour to talk about things, but we end up, there's so much that each one has been 2 to 3 hours. And it's, what I'm hearing over and over again is they knew the war was going to happen. We all did. I mean, even in the West, we knew the war was going to happen. We were hearing all the signs, and it was kind of inevitable. We're waiting for the strike. Well, the strike happened on February 24th. And so all these people, whether they're in Mariupol or Kherson or in these areas, Odessa, these areas that we're hearing about all the time on the news, they were just waiting too. And some of them, like, no one really, we knew of the threat, just like we would do in the US, like we knew, or in Canada, we knew of the threat, but until it actually happened, it didn't really become real. And they also kind of thought, it'll be over soon. It'll be a thing, and then it'll go away. And just like it always has, because since 2014, when when the revolution happened here, there's always been some back and forth between Russia and Ukraine, but people here did not quite think that it was going to be this big. So they woke up to bombs. Most people woke up to bombs somewhere around 4 a.m. And across the board, everyone says, they looked at their spouse, they looked at their children, whatever, and they said the war has started. And it did. And these cities in the south and the east were occupied so quickly by Russian troops. And some of them were occupied incredibly violently, and it remained incredibly violent the entire time. They were constantly under threats. The most moving story, well, they're all moving, but the one that sits with me that I have been falling asleep to thinking about is there's a woman who she has a handicapped son. He's in his early 20s, and the things were starting. They heard the first bombs, and she went all around trying to find a shelter. And there's a map that the city had with shelters on it. They weren't all really there. And the ones that she did find, they're basically basements, were full. And everyone was saying, we're full, we won't let you in. It was tight packed. People were worried about resources, how long they would last. And they didn't let her in. But so she ended up going back to her apartment. She lived up on a hill. She was kind of a wealthy person. She had her own business. She had 2 houses in the country. She was an entrepreneur. She was just, very smart, loved to travel. In her mid-50s. She went back to her apartment, which was on the 9th floor, and they waited. And they watched the city. They were up on a hill. They watched the city get bombed. And as the bombs got closer to her, the first one blew out the windows and of the whole building. And so they didn't have windows. It was wintertime. It's February. Very, very cold outside. And there's a rule here that people just know, and it's shocking to me that people grow up knowing this, the behind 2 walls, where you know that if there's a window or an outdoor space, you have to be behind 2 walls just in case a missile comes through. It'll hit the first wall, slow it down, second wall should stop it, and you're safe behind the second wall. So they went into the hallway because that was their behind 2 walls, and they went to the elevator, like I stood by the elevator shaft. And they did that, and they slept there. They stood there. They couldn't go away from, the wall that was separating them because of all the shelling. They stayed there for, I want to say it was 3 months. They ended up going down lower and lower. She witnessed people being shot. The trucks would come through and shoot anything that moved. The constant missiles and the big bullets. But they were able to, in the beginning, make it out during the daytime because all the shelling was at night. And during the daytime, she started going around to just walking around the local area, and every one of the shelters that she had tried to get into had been bombed. And either the people were killed instantly or they were buried alive, and anybody who came out to try to help them was shot. So she has this image of an infant's hand that was turned the wrong way, and then it was right next to the mother's hand. So that she was describing that, and it's just heartbreaking. She had other horrendous stuff happen to her as well. She ended up she went to a room to get something really fast. There was a blast. It blew her against the wall. She knocked out all of her teeth, broke her jaw, broke her ribs. She was in a coma for about 3 weeks, and her neighbors and her ex-husband, kind of funny to rely on your ex-husband, but she did for but she was in the hallway, and they were making sure she had hydration and that she was, they tried to tend for her wounds as much as they possibly could. And she ended up, when she woke up, she was in so much pain because her teeth were all cracked out. She, after a couple of days, took a wrench and pulled out the remainder of her teeth herself because of the pain that they were causing. And I mean, I just can't imagine. There's more this woman went through, but I just cannot imagine something like that. And to talk to her, she was an interview while we were talking to her, and she wanted to share her story because she wants the people who did the things that they did to her to be held accountable, because these are war crimes. They're shooting innocent children and women particularly. I mean, aiming at them and shooting them, that's a war crime. So she wants them held accountable. But when she was telling her story, at one point, all of us in the room just, like, we couldn't help but cry. It was just so, even the cameraman, and it was so emotional. And this woman apologized to us for upsetting us, and it was just so moving. It was, I won't ever forget that.
What town was she from?
Larson.
Which is whereabouts?
It's in the southeast. It's one of the ones it's being bombed now. We've seen a lot of images on television of it, and it looks like there's nothing left. So it's one of the very bombed out, occupied cities.
Is it still occupied by Russia, or has it been re-liberated by Ukrainians?
It has, I don't believe it's been liberated yet. It's part of the counteroffensive. It's not so far from Crimea. So it's one of the cities they want to take back, but there's no city left. There's no people left there. It's more about having access to Crimea at this point.
What happened to her son?
He's still with her. She was evacuated because, I think this is important to know, there were volunteers there's so many brave volunteers here. I cannot begin to tell you the bravery that we see of regular people here, and the determination to help each other is so incredible. There was a list that got out. These volunteers come in with a van during the daytime. It's never safe, but and kind of quickly swoop in. They have a list of people. They can quickly get them out. Because her son is disabled, he was on the list. So they were going to take him. And when they came to get the other people, I don't know how many people, 8 or 9 probably, they were going to be able to get out. There was a mother and 2 children on the list. And when this woman's ex-husband went to go find the mother and children, they lived behind the kindergarten, which had been bombed out. But he went, and a missile had gone through their home and burned the mother and children alive. And because they died, she got to go with her son. The volunteers did not tell her why she got to go until they got past the first checkpoint, because I'm not sure she would have gone feeling the guilt of taking the place of someone who had died like that. But that's why she got out.
and she obviously wants to tell her story. Is this the beginning of a war crime effort? Does she know who some of the people are that would be sentenced other than Putin?
Well, I'm not sure how all that's going to work. I'm not on that end of that, but Hope with Ukraine is working with some attorneys in the United States, and they're wanting to get these crimes documented, so that they can be prosecuted. I'm sure there's some kind of they'll be able to figure out who was in charge in what places. And I honestly don't know how that all works. My end of it is very much documenting it, and we're putting together a program called Say My Name Ukraine. It's on the Hope for Ukraine website, and we'll have all of these interviews on there. And we'll also be doing social media campaigns, because the biggest issue is that I just think that people don't know what's really happening here. And we're so overwhelmed and bombarded with bad news all the time. We've got fires in Hawaii, we've got, earthquakes, we've got floods, we've got all these things. And we're overwhelmed, and we don't feel like we can pay attention to all the things, but this is so pressing. This is so pressing. And we do have an opportunity, if we stood behind our governments in supporting Ukraine, and we desperately need to, we can get this war over with. And that's been the push. It's become a very political situation in the US. Unfortunately, in the US has a lot more power than a lot of other countries over whether or not we help. But right now, the help is coming, and we need that to continue. The reason, it's enough reason to have it be because people in Ukraine are being murdered. But the bigger reason, too, is that Putin has said he's not going to stop with Ukraine. If Ukraine loses, it'll be all of Eastern Europe that he's trying to overcome. We're definitely going to end up being in World War III. If it stops at Ukraine, it stops at Ukraine. And that's a really critical point that we need to recognize.
I disagree with you that people don't know, but I do think that while people know, the real benefit of what you're doing is that you're making the stories real. Because when you hear about murder, when you hear about rape, when you hear about bombs, when you hear about missiles, you become not accepting, but you're not as negatively, you're not as profoundly impacted when you hear about it over and over and over again, as you are when you're told about one person's story. One individual story makes it so much more real. And so I thank you and congratulate you for your bravery, and thank you for what you're doing, because hearing the one lady's story and thinking about having to scramble with your disabled son into the elevator lobby and staying there for months on end, only being able to venture out during the daytime, it makes it real. Stay with us, everyone. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in 2 minutes with Amanda Larson reporting into us from Lviv, Ukraine. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Someone who I've interviewed before because she's got an interesting story, Amanda Larson. She's from St. Louis, Missouri, correct?
Mm-hmm.
You decided to give up. You didn't give up your job, but you gave up your job in the office and started traveling around the world as sort of a digital nomad. And I think your communications for a law firm, and you've traveled the world doing it. And we had an interesting chat about your story there. But now you're with Hope for Ukraine in Lviv, Ukraine, documenting stories of people. And doing this for the potentiality of some war crimes, or if nothing else, just narrating and documenting the stories. What do they think about this gorgeous blonde from St. Louis walking in and asking them questions and asking them to hear the story?
There are gorgeous blondes here. This is a beautiful country. There's some beautiful people here. It's very fashionable. That was one of the things that surprised me so much, is I kind of expected a country in war to not have so much great fashion, and they're dressing a lot better than me. So, yeah.
So they're not shocked that you show up into the room?
Oh, no. Well, no. I think when I wander around to the stores, they greet me like they would greet anyone, but I don't speak Ukrainian. So sometimes when I say hello, and I always I always say hi. But when I say hello in English, I get these, oh, but other than that, people have been very welcoming, and it's been a really incredible experience.
One of the areas that we heard some of the worst stories right in the beginning of the invasion was Bakhmut, which was that suburb or that town north of Kyiv that was attacked, and some of the worst atrocities occurred. We heard stories of rape and shooting prisoners in the back, or not prisoners, but just citizens in the back of the head, and et cetera, et cetera. Did you interview anyone from Bakhmut by any chance?
I did. And the thing to note is that's not unique to Bakhmut. It's happening in lots of places, and especially places. I mean, it's not only the Wagner troops, but the Wagner troops are really responsible for a lot of that. They've taken a lot of people out of prison in Russia and promised them that they could have freedom if they only fight. And we're talking rapists and murderers and people who have nothing to lose. And it is absolutely inhumane, the things that are happening. And I cannot even, I always want to say I can't imagine, but the problem is I can't imagine. And I think we all can imagine. And that's what's the difficult thing.
Tell us a little bit more about the person from Bakhmut that you interviewed, if you could.
There have been a couple. I think the one that probably people can relate to most, there's a teacher who is, she's just wonderful. She's given her whole life to children. Her husband is also a teacher. Her mother's a teacher. She taught Ukrainian language. When the occupation first began, the city was occupied, but they were maybe a little kinder. I mean, it wasn't like a happy, friendly thing, but people still could speak their minds a little bit. And Ukraine, one of the beautiful things about Ukraine, and one of the reasons they don't want to be occupied by Russia, is they have freedom of speech. They can say anything about the president that they want to, and there's no prosecution for that. They have, they can do the things that most of the things we can do in the West without worrying about being prosecuted for it. So people were holding some peaceful demonstrations, and then the troops started to shoot them and throw bombs into the crowd. And these are regular people. They're not armed. They weren't doing anything violent. They were just saying, please don't. Well, maybe they weren't saying please, but they were saying, don't occupy our city. So as time went on, things got tighter and tighter. And she, as a teacher, the curriculum began to change forcefully, where they had to teach in Russian. They could not teach any Ukrainian anything. They needed to, they had to change to Russian books, and the history books were written for Russians. So they were very full of propaganda, I'll say, very inaccurate compared to what Ukrainian, versions of history were. And I'd like to think the Ukrainian versions were probably much more accurate here in Ukraine. One of the things that she said threw her off was, in most of Europe, World War II, the motto is never again. And in the books that they're seeing, the motto is we can one more time. So they're hearing so many things, and youth were recruited, and they call it a club. They say it's willfully, but people are also having to turn in their neighbors for, suspected, like being pro-Ukraine. So you don't really have a whole ton of choice other than to get involved in these things, other than, get kidnapped and taken to the cellars, which is where they're interrogated, sometimes never coming back. But it's like a youth SS that's being trained, and it's young people they're taught to shoot, they're taught propaganda, they're taught, very pro-Russian sayings, just like Hitler did. And it's quite frightening because, she was saying that even when this war is over, there are going to be all these youth who have been brainwashed, and they honestly think that what Putin is telling them is true. But she ended up on a list, and she and her husband and her mother, they fled. They found out they fled just in time. There's a telegraph on the app Telegraph that people talk here on that more than anything. The Russians do, and local people do. And they can talk about everything from what type of threat is happening when the sirens go off to any kind of anything. They're on telegraph. And there's a list that the Russians have of suspected, I don't remember the word that she said, but basically it's people who are suspected of being pro-Ukrainian. And she and her mother and her husband showed up on that list as wanted. So they were going to be captured and taken to the cellars. They say kidnapped here, and that really is what it is. The cellars, people are interrogated, many people are killed, some people disappear. We don't know where they go. Sometimes they are released. They just never know what's going to happen. So she and her husband ended up, well, her husband had to stay behind, and he later got out, but she went with a friend because they didn't have a car. And they got through these checkpoints. They ran out of food. She has 2 children. Her oldest is 18 years old. Her daughter, first they had all the things going on with COVID at 18, and then she was supposed to start her first semester of college, and she was not able to because the war started. So if you can kind of imagine what this is doing to young people of that age, where they've never had a normal life. They had COVID and now they've got this, and they've never had, young adulthood or even, those teen years of being normal. But they got through what normally would take about 3 hours to get from one town to the next, took 6 days, because at one point for 5 hours, the Russians were keeping people from going through a checkpoint. They were humiliating them in every way they could. They were afraid. People were afraid to go out of their cars to go to the bathroom because they were afraid they're going to get shot. The Russians looked for any kind of colors. They checked everyone's phones. If your phone or your computer didn't turn on, they threw it away because they needed to check it for any kind of pro-Ukrainian messages. They check your social media, they check your texts, they check everything. They look like, for example, I've got Ukrainian colors on my nails. I wouldn't be let through because I have Ukrainian colors. So they had to throw out everything they possibly could. But even more humiliating, people had taken, when the ATMs were still working, they took all the money out that they could, so they would have some money, because nobody's credit cards worked. There wasn't electricity for a lot of the time, things like that. And they tried to take some of their valuables with them. All those are stolen along in the checkpoint, multiple checkpoints. And I've heard that over and over again, that, just like when people were fleeing places in World War II, and they were trying to sew in their, family heirlooms and their jewelry and all that kind of thing. All those things are also now today being stolen. And when they are stolen, there's a lot of celebration on the part of the Russians of, oh, look what I got. And there's a lot of bragging, things like that. And they're leaving people with nothing. And I can't emphasize enough that these are people like you and me. If you could imagine having to be forced out of your home and, scared for your life and trying to take off with, think of what would you put in one suitcase? That's most families have one suitcase for the whole family. What would you put in there? And then what if that was rifled through and your most special things were taken? I mean, it's hard to imagine.
We've heard stories of Ukrainian children being kidnapped and taken to Russia. Do you hear those stories? Do you think they're real?
I think they're real. I have heard those stories. I've heard the families I have interviewed, their children were not kidnapped, but everybody knows someone who was. So, yeah, and it's a reprogramming, and it has everything to do with what we were talking about with the youth groups that they're starting. And
you're saying that to some people are being kidnapped in Lviv itself. So somehow there's Russian agents that are
not in Lviv. Ukraine? Yeah, not in Lviv. In the occupied areas.
Oh, in the occupied areas. That's understandable. What about all these stories of rape? Have you heard these stories? Do you think they're real? Some of them seem so outrageous that they, I question whether any human could actually do these things.
I've heard stories like that. Yes. I question how humans can do the stuff they're doing every day. Since I've been here, when I'm listening to these stories, there's no story that I've heard that I haven't thought. How I thought humans were somehow more evolved than this, but the hatred, they're worse than animals in some of these cases. I came into this, I should say, I'm a peace and love kind of person. I like to see the positive in everybody. I like to, even this war, my initial thoughts were there's some really good people on both sides. And then there's it's just the powers that be fighting and the people are pawns. And, that's what I've thought. Hearing some of these stories, I still think there are good humans in the world, regardless of where you are. But I can understand the sentiment here that is so anti-Russian, because there have been so many horrendous things that have happened at the hands of Russians here. And it's, it kind of pains me to say stuff like that, because I'm not generally, I have friends from Russia in the US who I really love. I have a hard time understanding how any human being can do the things that have been happening to these people.
One of the big issues at the Nuremberg trials after World War II was the question about whether people did these war crimes of their own volition, or whether they were directed to, trained to, ordered to by people above, which they connected up with, as you mentioned, the SS and other things, such that they were able to sentence the people in leadership positions, because they said these were directed and led and trained from above. What's your sense? Are these one-off things by criminals that were taken out of jails and so therefore just did it of their own volition? Or do you think they're actually being told to do some of these things?
Well, I think there's certainly an allowance for it. But there's, we know from psychology, groupthink is a big thing. And when you have all this support to do these things and validation, people do things they would never do on their own because it's okay. And that's exactly what's happening, or it's not condemned by leadership by any means. And there's leadership who are more, I have no doubts that there are people in leadership position who are doing these things too. So I don't know that it's ever okay. Even I know that it's not, to ever say, well, the leader was doing it, so we can do this horrible, inhumane as well, the inhumanity thing as well. I don't think it's an excuse. I don't think it matters if it was directed or not. There is a human element in all of us, and we have to choose. And when people choose these evil things, we know it's evil. It's evil to rape people. It's evil to murder people. It's evil to shoot children and women, and it's evil to shoot men too. We have a choice in these things, and it's all about who we are. And I think you and I have no doubt, I'm going to assume you're the same. If somebody told you to shoot somebody innocent, we couldn't do it. We just wouldn't be able, or certainly rape somebody, or, that kind of thing. We have a choice. So it really doesn't matter to me why they're doing it. It matters to me that they're doing it.
We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Chatting tonight with Amanda Christman Larson, who was a world traveler as a digital nomad. She's taken her job on the road and has chronicled this incredible trip that she's made around the world, continuing to work for communications for a law firm back in St. Louis, Missouri. But now she's in Lviv, Ukraine, with an organization that are trying to tell some stories of Ukrainian people. Amanda, if you had an opportunity to speak with the President of the United States or some of the nominees for president, and or the Prime Minister of Canada, or the Minister of Foreign Affairs or the Secretary of State in the United States, what would you tell them the West needs to do in regards to Ukraine and Russia?
Well, to be honest, I think once we get to a leadership position anywhere in the US or Canada or anywhere, it's really about what the people want. And so my main focus, I mean, sure, I would tell them, help, let's get this over with. But my main focus is to educate you and me and regular people, because it's our will that ends up making a difference. If people can't get behind aid, if you take a look at what's happening right now in US politics, Biden is wanting to help. He's putting forth a lot of money, and it's becoming a very political thing where people are being told to look at the money part of it more. And, why are we getting involved in something that's not ours? This is very much ours. It's a war between Putin and NATO, really, when it comes down to it. If it continues, it will not stop at Ukraine. So we have to get involved. But the bigger picture is that, even in World War II, US did not want to get involved until it hit home. And I want these stories to help it hit home, because if we can see that this is people just like you and me, this is people with our jobs, people who have lives so much like ours, and these horrible things are happening to them, that should be good enough. That should be the humanity part of that. It should be enough. And just like when that very initial video came out of the woman with her children being shot and killed while she was trying to run from the fire zone, just like when people saw that, they saw, oh my gosh, look at that. That could be me. Or they at least empathized somehow. That's what these stories are about, because so much happened because of that one woman. So much sentiment changed because of that one woman. I want people to understand that it's not just her, it's all kinds of people, and they're just as important, and the stories are just as impactful.
Amanda Larson, thank you so much for joining us and telling us the story. And thank you for the job that you're doing for this organization about Hope for Ukraine. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thanks for joining, and let's do what Amanda is suggesting and realize how critically important this is, and realize the personal impact on people just like you and I. Thanks. Good night, everybody.